So thank you all for coming back again for the second half. So my slide that opens this half is, on the one side we have a Donald Trump cartoon where a US journalist is saying the only thing we have to fear is, and then there's a whole bunch of people, including Donald Trump, yelling out fear itself. And it's holding up placards saying Mexican rapists, gay, whatever, and all the kind of, and Islamophobic stuff. And so all the kind of things that we hear as much also in Australian society that are all generated by the fears we've been talking about. However, I would question that cartoon. We often hear, this is a very common saying, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And I think, who was it? Was it Churchill or who was it who said, it was... Yeah, anyway, somewhere around the time of the Second World War. Yeah, fear is a problem, but it's not the fear we have to fear, it's the language that feeds the fear, I think, that we really have to be worried about. And on the other side, we have Shirley MacLaine saying, fear makes strangers of people who would be friends. And that's going to be the theme of this second half. So just to, in Leviticus, chapter 19, verses 33 to 34, we have the verse saying, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. So this is the ideal that we're really working towards. We want to be able to treat every other human being who comes to Australia as a native-born Australian, bearing in mind that most of us come from immigrant, well, in fact, all of us come from immigrant families who've all come to Australia and in some cases been mistreated when we arrived and are now treated as native-born. But the point is, why do you have to wait 2 generations to treat someone as if they're native-born? The stranger is an Australian native the moment they arrive. So I'm going to quote from Elizabeth Eaton, who's the presiding bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and this was in response to the Orlando shooting on 13 June. The perpetrator of this hate crime did not come out of nowhere. He was shaped by our culture of division, which itself has been misshapen by the manipulation of our fears. So in the first half, we talked all about why we ended up divided against other people and how fear leads to these kind of extreme and violent and extremely disturbing consequences. And again, remember we talked in the first half about Romans 7:19, for I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. So we've been talking all about why, no matter how well-intentioned we are, often we end up thinking or doing things that are against what we know the gospel calls us to do. So fear drives good people for good reasons to inadvertently do things that contribute to the very thing they fear. So this is the really interesting phenomenon, is that often the more afraid someone is, the more they react in the more these moral intuitions get strengthened, and the more it drives their actions, the more they actually usually contribute to the thing they fear. So, in fact, I was listening to an incredibly good paper by Scott Appleby, who was one of the scholars in the US who worked on a fundamentalism project in the 1980s and 90s. And his comment about their findings about fundamentalisms through all the religions in the world. They did this massive, massive project, and they produced 5 volumes. And they looked across not just monotheisms, but all Hinduism, Buddhism, everything, and fundamentalist movements within all the religions. And one of their conclusions was that what fundamentalism does is it drives people to do these violent actions. And so he asked the question, when you do something like in Nice, mowing down all those people and killing them, who are you targeting? Who do you want to respond to that action? So he was talking about the Trade Center destruction in the US. But when a terrorist act is committed, who is it targeted at? Any answers? Yeah? Okay, so the answer is no. It's not targeted at the nation or the citizens of the nation in which it happens. It's targeted at the lazy believers of the religion behind the person who commits the act. It's a millennialist, kind of apocalyptic end times kind of mentality that says the rest of you Muslims or the rest of you Christians in shooting abortion in abortion clinics in the US, for instance, or the rest of you whatever religion we want to put in there, you're apathetic believers. You're not getting it. That this is right now, the end times are coming right now. You have to rise up and live out your religion in a really active way. And so all of these acts are actually targeted not at the people who are the victims of these acts, or the nation. They're actually targeted at the believers of the belief system from which the perpetrator comes. But what happens is that governments automatically react, or we automatically react in ways which then is we radicalize, and it's like the evil, we need to stop everybody going to Syria to fight in Syria, or we need to do these things. So you do things against your own citizens or whatever, that then, in fact, in the end, or you go to war in Iraq, that then confirm what exactly that radical is saying, which is this nation hates us, they hate our religion, they're trying to destroy our religion, and in fact, that's when everything escalates. So fear drives good people for good reasons to inadvertently do things that contribute to the very thing they fear. That's a really fundamental thing that we need to take home today. So how do we develop the trust, faith, and courage to resist fear? And that's what we're going to talk about in this thing. So I'm just going to recap very briefly from the previous part. So human beings are fundamentally selfish. We've got those small number of basic values that inform how individual human beings cooperate. And these preconscious moral intuitions underwrite all types of social groups. And those 5 moral intuitions again, about care/harm, fairness/cheating, loyalty/betrayal, authority/subversion, and sanctity/degradation. And again, those moral conceptual metaphors that we talked about, morality is up, immorality is down, immorality is light, immorality is darkness, purity versus rottenness, and all of those ones going down that list. Again, just to remind people. So Nadia Bolz-Weber, I have to say, I'm becoming enormously fond of. So if people don't know, she's a Lutheran pastor in a church in Denver, which is called the House of All Saints and Sinners. And it's a quite radical congregation that welcomes people from all backgrounds and just totally lives out what it means to be Lutheran in an incredibly fundamental way. Everybody is a saint, everybody is a sinner. And it's all about learning to not be self-righteous about one's faith, but to be welcoming in the most radical possible way. And this is actually a quote from her husband at one point. And he said to her, Nadia, the thing that sucks is that every time we draw a line between us and others, Jesus is always on the other side of it. And that's, again, something to remember, because Jesus comes to us in the stranger. And if we draw a line, we're putting Jesus over there, and we're not welcoming him. So overcoming fear of the stranger, fear makes strangers of people who would be friends. And again, Elizabeth Eaton, the presiding bishop of the ELCA, in response to the Orlando shooting, she says, our work begins now. We need to examine ourselves individually and as a church to acknowledge the ways we have divided and been divided. We must stand with people who have been othered. We must speak peace and reconciliation into the cacophony of hatred and division. We must live the truth that all people are created in God's image. And then again, Nadia Bolz-Weber, and when she was converted to Lutheranism, as it were, and before she went into the seminary to become a pastor, her pastor in San Francisco said the 5 basic things you need to know about being Lutheran, and these are 3 of them. God's grace is a gift that is freely given to us. We don't earn a thing when it comes to God's love, and we only try to live in response to the gift. We are simultaneously sinner and saint, 100% of both, all the time. The movement in our relationship to God is always from God to us, always. We can't, through our piety or goodness, move closer to God. God is always coming near to us, most especially in the Eucharist and in the stranger. So 2 of the most fundamental things, God comes to us in communion, he comes to us in the stranger. And the answer is, yeah, we're a saint and a sinner. So we're not going to always be good about dealing with strangers or welcoming strangers. We have to learn that we can only do the good that we try to do, and ask for forgiveness for when we don't welcome strangers, but then move forward and continue to try to be more and more welcoming to strangers. So if you remember, I said that the human brain was morally biconceptual. We talked about habituation patterns of thought and behavior that entrenched neural circuits. We talked about fear strengthening neural bindings, particularly in the conservative domain. And we talked about empathy overriding an entrenched pattern of thought. So now we're going to talk a bit about strategies for overcoming fear of the stranger, and both our own fear of strangers and other people's fear of strangers. So what I want to maybe talk about now, and this is where we can be a lot more interactive in this part, is I see this happening at 3 or 4 different levels. So one is, how do we overcome our own entrenched neural bindings or intuitive ways of looking at the other as a result of all the language we're hearing and seeing in the media? How do we overcome other people's entrenched patterns of thinking about the stranger? So that's number 2. 3, how do we become active in the public to overcome these kinds of entrenched ways of seeing strangers or immigrants, refugees in the Australian public at the national level or our local community level? And how do we become active internationally? So it's like all these different levels at which we need to work to overcome fear of the stranger. And so these may be in practical terms, in how we welcome strangers and act as a result of overcoming the way we think about strangers. It may be in terms of the language we use, and it may be as simple as Facebook, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So fear of the stranger goes both ways. Our brains all work the same, and the one thing we need to remember is that strangers are just as afraid of us as we are of them, and someone has to take the first step. The reality is that many of the people who are refugees from war-torn areas or who are deeply traumatized are not in a position to make the first step. So it's up to us as Christians to make the first step, or as just compassionate human beings, because it's really hard. Most of them are in a position of fear themselves. They're still traumatized by their experiences. Often when they are located within the community in Australia, it's very hard for them to reach out. It's a different culture. There are many, many reasons why they're afraid. And we are the ones who have to take the first step. I talked about how language is incredibly powerful in tapping into these moral intuitions. So the one thing we need to do is we need to resist the natural urge to argue directly or use reason with other people who express fear or hate. Theirs is not a conscious or rational response. Within their own mind, it is moral and justified, just as to you, your own position is right and moral. Neither of you will change the other's mind, and they will end up more convinced of their position. Each time you use the same language that you do to argue against their position, you strengthen the neural circuitry in their brains that entrenches their moral intuitions, i.e., that refugees or immigrants are cheats, criminals, all terrorists, lazy, diseased, or undisciplined. So the worst thing you can do is actually argue directly with someone who holds any of these positions. And that works not just for immigrants and refugees, but ordination of women, any other situation, homophobia, all sorts of positions like that. You cannot change someone's mind because it's an emotional, deep, subconscious thing that's going on in their mind, and they, as far as they're concerned, they are totally right. And why not? We're convinced that we're totally right, depending on what position we hold. It's really about how do you get around that by not dealing with it directly. So Facebook is a huge issue these days with social media. And if you're talking or Facebooking with someone, and this is the single most difficult thing to do, if their opinion is governed by fear, you have to somehow step back and identify the conceptual metaphors and frames that they're using in the language that they use on Facebook. and try introducing a different conceptual frame. And I have to say, I find this the hardest thing to do. It's one thing kind of sort of working out where they're coming from and what's driving it, but trying to reframe it to something that is not going to be problematic is actually extremely difficult. And so one thing maybe we need to do collectively as a church and as communities who want to welcome strangers and refugees, immigrants, or change government policies is to somehow practice and try to develop a system of frames that are going to counter the problematic frames and maybe share them around. And in fact, the most effective strategy may be to divert attention. In fact, don't engage directly. Divert it to another topic, but one that actually emphasizes care and fairness, because that sort of is something everyone tends to agree on. So when you get into religious conflict, which is the fundamental area I'm interested in, the one thing that that all religions agree on is that caring for others, so loving the neighbor and being fair towards others, is something every single religion agrees on. They all hold that as a fundamental, important thing. And if you can shift emphasis to that, then it defuses the other ones about loyalty in group, group identity, about tradition, about orthodoxy, about purity. So really, everything is always about emphasizing care and fairness, if you can possibly do that. And then creating empathy in yourself and other people by telling personal stories. And this is the single most powerful way to counter these kinds of positions, is to tell stories. And it's one of those things where I was resistant to it. You think, oh, it's like, what does telling a story do? But the reality is that it can be incredibly powerful if it's a genuine story that creates empathy towards individuals. So if you talk about your own positive encounters with immigrants or refugees, or heartwarming stories about individual immigrants or refugees, their struggles and successes, or if you point to articles in papers where they have told their own stories, always be sincere. It should never be a false story, it has to be a genuine story. And if you don't have personal stories, so point them to seek them out in the media and share them. So for instance, I was in Sydney last year at a conference, and in the newspaper there was a really powerful article about a refugee from one of the African countries who said that his whole community was treated very badly in Sydney, but he himself had basically pulled himself into Macquarie University and gone through the law school and is now an advocate for other refugee communities and has a thriving practice. And it was this whole personal story of success and of working hard. And see, it taps into that whole moral strength thing that even conservatives will respect. I helped myself. I pulled myself up by the bootstraps. That kind of story can be quite powerful. Another one is to create situations in which you, your community, and immigrants or refugees meet and get to know each other over a shared interest. And this needs to be something that activates the Care Foundation or brings you together. So it has to be neutral. It cannot be one where there's a power imbalance. So where you end up in a kind of paternalistic situation. So sport, children, and food are the three easiest things and the three most neutral things that you can do. So when I gave this talk in the US, there was a naval chaplain in the group, and he said that in Iraq, his general asked for soccer balls to be brought over to Iraq, and what they did is they played soccer with the local children in the community they were trying to win the hearts and minds of. And it was incredibly powerful because the parents then come out and you start talking to them, you get to know each other as human beings, you realize that you're just all the same, you care about the same thing, which is your children, and in the end, you find these neutral grounds on which it activates the care intuition, it creates empathy because you learn about them as individual human beings. You can't other them if you've learned their name and you know who they are and you've learned about what drives them and their passions and interests. And food is another one because everyone likes to eat. And there's a reason why sharing a table with people and communion, the Eucharist, the reason why the Eucharist binds us together is it's a very fundamental human mechanism that we come together over food. Or creating childcare groups. So childcare groups for refugees is also another very effective and powerful mechanism. So try not to do things that emphasize the differences in culture. You really want to try to do these neutral things until then people become more open to learning about each other's cultures and differences. Pleasure strengthens the communal bonds by fostering in-group intimacy. So pleasure actually is one of those things that activates in the brain. And the same as caring for the vulnerable conceptually strengthens the care foundation and a more inclusive mindset. So there's a reason, for instance, why political rallies work. They activate pleasure, and it binds people together into a group that is all fired up against a common cause or whatever. And work to develop one-on-one relationships. So discover people's passions and skills. So again, it's about not creating situations where it's paternalistic or you're kind of doing something for someone else because they're in need. But in fact, you really want to be about empowering them to empower themselves. So what can I do for you, knowing what your situation is now, that will help you to cope in this community, in this society? It may be sharing about the Australian culture, helping them to negotiate government forms, those kinds of things where you walk with them, beside them, but you're not taking over, you're not disempowering them, and that way you don't feed into the cheating foundation. So it's not about their writing off us, but they're actually working for themselves, to empower themselves, to better themselves, and we're helping them, walking by their side. One thing is to remind yourself that we're all sinful human beings. Among immigrants and refugees, there will be people who are cheats, have nasty personalities, and are unlikable or mistreat others. They are in the minority, and that's the other thing, because the first thing that happens is that we get selective framing from the government that is all immigrants are cheats. All immigrants are like this. Let me tell you a story about so-and-so. And it's, yes, there are people who are going to be cheats, who are not going to be nice, who may be criminals, but they're not all refugees. So there's this kind of fake framing that says one person, it's that rotten apple thing. One person is the same as everybody else. They're all individuals, they're all human beings, they're all like us. And in fact, half the time, there are more of us who are cheating or doing immoral things than there are in the group that we're trying to work with. So challenge yourself to not to reject immigrants or refugees whom you personally find it difficult to like. God comes to us in the most unlikely people. He didn't tell us that everyone would be lovable. So it's another thing where I love Nadia Bolz-Weber. She has a whole book about accidental saints, where she talks about people from the NRA, people whom she thought she would dislike passionately. And she learned that they're perfectly normal, moral human beings who, you learn to have humility, to realize that there are things in other people that are good, even if you initially don't think so. And then lastly, don't try to suppress inevitable thoughts about refugees or immigrants that are negative, because we're constantly being bombarded by this language and visual media that taps into these things, that pops them up in our brain. So the worst thing you can do is suppress them, because the more you suppress, the more power you give to them, the more they bounce back and actually become stronger. So what you want to do is, this is a bit like ACT, which is activation commitment therapy, I think. Basically, let them float in, recognize them, let them float out. And just say, that's a thought, it's not me. It's unfortunate, but let it just go. And then try to work on, kind of strengthening other ways of looking at them in your own brain, or reason with yourself. And if they're persistent, just distract yourself by thinking of something completely different. These are all simple cognitive techniques that are important. So at this point, I'm going to ask you to, we'll talk about that in a moment, but does anyone want to share any thoughts or responses to what we've been talking about? Ideas, practical ideas about how we can welcome strangers in our communities? Yep, Tricia.
I just wanted to say that you gave sport, food and children as 3 things that could bring people together. Oh, and I think you left out music.
Yes, I did actually, because, yes. And
especially if you learn their song, rather than they teach you their song.
Yes. Thank you, Tricia, because actually, yes, and cognitively, music is as good as a hug in terms of what's the neurochemical that music activates? It's so, well, it's yes. I think it's like oxytocin. Yeah, I think so. But what it does is it actually bonds people. It makes people feel very warm towards each other. So you're absolutely right. Music is a fourth one that I hadn't worked out. So yeah. Okay. Yes. Yep. Yep. And again, because that activates the right brain. So there is some research that says that the more you activate the left brain thinking, which tends to be like engineering and that kind of logical thinking, there are more fundamentalist engineers apparently than anybody else. Sorry, engineers, but I don't know whether they're just drawn to it. Yeah, I know. Well, actually, that was a psychologist in the US who was looking at terrorism and fundamentalism, but sorry, in the UK from Cambridge University. Yeah, but actually, yes, the more you stimulate right brain thinking, the more you actually create empathy and build and that sort of what do you call it? Inclusiveness. Yes. Yeah. So that's again okay. So that's good art as well as music. Anyone else? Yeah.
Completely from left field with respect to fear and strangers, actually, but on your comment about the terrorists and that they're actually telling the rest of their lazy religious counterpart, do we know, though, that is actually the message getting home to their home, be it Islamic countries? I mean, how do we know that? Because obviously we have the Western view of they feel like they're attacking. We get the impression they're attacking us. How did they formulate that?
So when you analyse some of their social media posts after those events and some of the rhetoric, it's very clear that they're telling each other, look, you know, the Western, France hates us or the US hates us and they hate Islam and you know, it's kind of a way of whipping up their own kind of followers. But the question is whether it's effective is another matter. I'm not sure it is because, in fact, so when Scott Appleby was talking about this, he was saying that one reason why ISIS is beheading people is because then you develop a tolerance to these horrifying acts, and they're not effective enough anymore. So you've got to go the next step, and in fact, then it can actually flip the other way and actually turn off people who would be followers because you're now doing something that is so revolting and repulsive and so against your normal religion that it only is effective to some people, but turns off everybody else. So it's a kind of a complex thing, but the actual motivation is to whip up lazy, apathetic people within the same religion. Yeah. Julianne?
I don't know if this is too tangential, but this notion of doing good, you know, that we're going to do good is always something that I find really troublesome. You know, we're going to go and help these people, we're going to do some good. Because, I mean, and it goes across all the areas you were talking about, refugees, you know, other minority groups. People tend to help in the way that they want to help. And there's not so much thought as to whether the help that they're giving is actually helpful. And I think that's really important coming from a standpoint of someone with a disability. There's all people out there who want to help you in their way. Now, there's two arguments because, yes, you can't ask people to help in ways that makes them feel uncomfortable, so people have got to be able to contribute what they can. But like Michael Lunick said, then the people getting the help are forced to feel grateful even if the help isn't quite what they want.
Yes.
And that's the thing that I find, you know, really concerning about the whole movement is that there's all this well-meaning and well-meant, you know, activity. And I like that you're starting to put together ideas about how it can actually genuinely be helpful, because I think that's really important.
Yes, that's actually an incredibly important point. So one of the things is... Sorry, yep.
Missionaries in refugee camps who do assist with all the physical needs, but one of the first things that they would do is sit people down in a room and show them a film about why they should be Christian.
Yeah, yeah. So, and I'm still kind of unpacking some of this stuff for myself, but I think what I've learnt so in the US, my congregation has a very powerful ministry to homeless women and low-income women, and we're also now tapping into the local Hispanic community from Central America in DC, in our local neighborhood. And part of it is learning to ask them what they need, what their problems are, how can we walk with you to help you solve them. And so at the moment, the women from the local community are using our church, the Hispanic community, to work out their own childcare cooperative, for instance, because one of their big problems is that they're all working 3 or 4 jobs that are lowly paid to make ends meet. And the neighborhood is gentrifying, and so their rents are going up and up and up. And so childcare is a huge issue for them, for the women, if they're working. And so part of it is listening. We have to do a lot of listening to people. And language can be a huge barrier when it's people who are immigrants and refugees, because they may or may not have a language they can communicate to you in, which is largely our failing, because we tend to expect everyone to speak English. And it's quite humbling when you're in a country where you don't speak their language and they don't speak English. It can be very challenging, and you have to find ways to get around that. And part of it is being open to learning their language, and part of it is starting to teach them the language of the country that they're now in, to help them to navigate the systems in that country. And but yeah, the single most important thing you can do is listen, and to identify their strengths and their hopes and their passions, and then ask them what you can do to help them achieve them. So one of the things I learned in Canada when we lived there was a strong Mennonite community, where they have a system of circles of support. And so there was this circle of support system for women coming out of the local jail. And so the idea is you don't just dump a prisoner out in the community after they've served their time and hope that they somehow survive. What you do is you create a circle of support. But that circle of support and so they got to know them over a 6 to 12-month period in the jail before these women were released. Then it's really just someone who checks in with you once a week or on a regular basis and says, how's it going? Have you found housing? I've heard this, possibility. You might want to try ringing them and whatever. So it's not finding the housing for them. It's not finding them food, finding their needs. It's saying, let me support you as you work to find what you need. And I think that's actually quite a powerful system, and one that is another possibility. One of the things I've been thinking about is if you are in a community where you do have refugees or immigrants locally, I would suggest that you work on, once you've worked out how to approach the community and get to know them as people and individuals, is work out a buddy system maybe, where you match up families with each other. And it may not always work, you may not bond, but a system where it's a one-on-one relationship thing, where it's a kind of a check-in, where you act as somebody who is a backup. I mean, really, the single most problematic thing in the US, for instance, without proper welfare, is that there's no safety net. And it's about being someone's safety net, sort of their backup, kind of being there to sort of catch them when something does go wrong and help them. And so the slide here is about hospitality in Greek. The word for hospitality is philoxenia, which people thought was love of the stranger, but it's not. It's actually being a friend, philos in the sense of friend, a friend to strangers. And if you look at the idea of friendship, and maybe this is one conceptual frame for overcoming fear of strangers. If we're a friend to strangers and strangers are our friends, then it's kind of like mateship. So friends don't cheat each other, so you strengthen the fairness intuition. Friends care, they're there when they need them, so there's sort of a support, help, backup, whatever. So it's caring, intuition. Friends are equal. So they're colorblind. Good friendship is one that's equal and colorblind. It doesn't care about disability, financial status, religion, gender, culture. There's no hierarchy in it. And friends are loyal. So it feeds that loyalty kind of foundation too, that you look after each other. You're there when something happens. And I mean, this is just something I've been thinking over myself, as whether this is one way to maybe reframe the whole stranger thing. And maybe another way to think about them is like a web where we're all interconnected. So if that person suffers, then I suffer too, somehow. That's maybe a little abstract. I'm not sure that's going to work when you think of like the ecosystem kind of idea. But the challenge is for us to find frames that become powerful for us, that help us to navigate welcoming and being radically welcoming to people. Because it's actually hard to put yourself out there to work with people who are not like you, basically. I mean, we want people to be like ourselves, fundamentally. And it's a big cognitive problem for us all. So in the ELCA in the US, one of our biggest challenges is racism, actually, as a church. We're one of the Lutherans are one of the whitest churches in the whole of the US. And it's really interesting. Well, actually, I have to say the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America is the whitest church. So a lot of the African-American Lutheran congregations are within the Missouri Synod. And then we don't talk to each other. And so there are a lot of people who are now activating. So the current presiding bishop is very strong on racism and inclusiveness, racial inclusiveness. And that's something where we think we're very welcoming to strangers as long as they look like us, and very bad at welcoming people of other racial and ethnic kind of groups. So anybody else? Yep.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Mayer. I take a long time to make my points, so I apologise in advance. I'm very interested in your point about language as a power game, which I would agree with. I'm coming from the context of a hivist, so you know in advance where I'm going. And
remember, I said that wasn't a bad thing necessarily.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, it could be. Everything I'm about to say is a waste of everyone's time. I'm conscious of the fact that in the context of my own hive, as a white male pastor, I ostensibly have all the power, and I'm coming from a position of strength, and I have a voice that other people might envy. As soon as I step out of that hive into the wider cultural hive, I realise I have a very different experience. I have no power at all. As a white male Christian minister, I'm almost an enemy of the state. Increasingly that I'm the reason people like me is holding back society progressing. Now that's how those perceptions are created is another whole discussion, I suppose. But I'm interested because the rhetoric of cultural rhetoric or media rhetoric, it could be we're reading different sources, because to me, the cultural rhetoric that I read is very much positioned against people who raise questions about immigration and refugees. And so frequently when we hear words like homophobe or Islamophobe, the word phobia by definition really means an irrational fear.
Yeah.
And this language has become almost unquestioned. So that as soon as the term, homophobe, if the word homophobe or Islamophobe is used against me, immediately what I hear I'm being told is, well, you're irrational. You have a problem. Go and sit over there. We have treatments for people like you. And then, so those people feel completely disempowered by this kind of cultural rhetoric. I suspect from what appears to be the rapid rise of the far right in many European countries now is because people who feel that way have felt disempowered by political correctness, have been disempowered by this kind of language. I suspect that something like Brexit, for example, which took a lot of people by surprise all over the world, which from all the analysis I've read seems to suggest that immigration was one of the driving concerns for people. Yep. Now, every British person I've asked here in the safety of Brisbane, well, what did you think about it? All voted to exit. Now, even though they're not affected by that immigration. But they felt passionately that, the UK is somehow being undone by the European Union. And so the only place they get a voice is the ballot box. And so this is kind of like a protest, if you like, that political correctness and the language of phobia, etc., has disempowered people on the right for such a long time that they feel they've got nowhere left to go. Now, I'm not even sure what my point is out of that, except to say that, yeah, I agree that language is a power game, but I'd suggest that for people who sit on the right side of the cultural equation, that they have felt disempowered by this. The whole thing with immigration, it seems to me, people like to paint refugees as good or as bad in a broad brush, and I'm not accusing you of doing that. But the situation is obviously very complicated. I think it's possible to be pro-refugees, but also pro-strong border controls. I don't think those things are necessarily mutually exclusive. So for people, say in Nice, for example, which is the hot topic at the moment, or people who lost someone in Bataclan, for example, probably, or watched their 6-year-old child crushed by a lorry driver, probably wouldn't see their fear of someone Middle Eastern looking as being irrational. And it's not that they necessarily hate or reject all refugees, but the point is, well, we don't know. It's not that all refugees are pathogens or pathogentic, it's that we don't know whether there might be a bad apple in the bunch. And that's what scares us. Again, I'm not sure what the point is out of all of that, but I just feel like sort of standing up for the hive.
Yes, okay. So everything you say actually kind of illustrates what I've been talking about, which is none of what I've been talking about is good or bad in itself. On the other hand, it's the actions that happen as a result of the ways we think that matter, and we have to always ask ourselves, are those actions for the good of the nation or the group or whatever, or not? And that becomes equally problematic too, because everyone will disagree on whether it's a good or a bad action, like Brexit, for instance. So you could rationally argue, that in fact, economically, it's a very bad decision, because disentangling themselves from the European Union is going to be very, very costly and very problematic. And in fact, they may end up worse off. On the other hand, they preserve their border sovereignty and the purity of, or as they see it, of Britain, which is a really strong driver. I mean, it's all about, I see it as really, it's about trying to recover a pure Britain that has been contaminated by all these refugees, and the same in France. Really, it's about colonial, the end result of colonial policies from the 1800s, where you've got all these different races now in a melting pot in the nation, and people find that deeply disturbing. So for Australia, for instance, we need to ask ourselves, then how can we all live together as a multicultural country without harming each other? So in the end, it's all about, I think it's all about harm and care, really, and as Christians, it's all about harm and care in the end. And that needs to be the fundamental question we ask. Are we harming people or caring for them? And it's not about doing good, it's about caring at a very deep and important kind of level. So I mean, yes, and those fears are genuine. I mean, this is the thing. So it's not about, what I wanted to say is that when I'm saying these are driven by emotions or intuitions, it's not that they're irrational in a bad or a good sense. They're just intuitive. And it's what helps us to think. I mean, it's just what drives us, what makes us think in these ways and behave in these ways. And you're quite right in everything you say. I mean, this is the world we have to live in. One reason, I mean, we talk about, sin and virtue or striving for goodness. What we would see as being sinful human beings is really about being morally intuitive human beings, really, in the bottom line. And until we accept that that's the way our brains work and the way we operate, we can't negotiate that with each other. And really, it's about, in the end, we all care for each other, really. I mean, I was telling someone during the break, I mean, even if we were all rabidly anti-Islam or something, if there was a natural disaster in Brisbane at this moment and you had been protesting against a mosque, I bet you anything that the same people the next day would be helping them mop up or care for those people, and would see absolutely no conflict in their previous position and their current action. Really, it's about, in the end, I think, emphasizing care and care for each other. I mean, if we don't do that, then we can't live together as a community really. And then, I mean, theologically, it develops into things like, kind of forgiveness and God coming to us in a stranger. I mean, all of those issues at a theological level, but fundamentally at just a biological level, this is just how it all kind of operates, and we need to kind of recognize that. But thank you. Yeah? Heidi.
Can I ask about the role of humour and also, like you've had a lot of kind of comics, really,
Yeah.
but that help people kind of maybe view things differently. Does that change people's minds neurologically?
So yes, so visual images are just as powerful as words, because they're both tapping into. They're both linguistic, in a sense, and it's the same as. There was a powerful story where a colleague of mine who's a Catholic priest from the Cairns diocese was saying that he and his friend had done a banner for the Catholic cathedral in Cairns that was St. Monica, so it's called St. Monica, which is St. Augustine's mother. And she was from North Africa, Numidian. And so they gave her an incredibly dark face. And an Aboriginal woman walked into the cathedral and went, I didn't know there were any Aboriginal saints. And she felt instantly at home because that visual image said to her, you are included. You are one of God's people. And it's those simple things that we don't even realize. So even, I have to say, even our overhead Sunday slides, the images we use, we need to be actually quite careful about what we're putting up there, because we can convey all sorts of unintentional kind of subconscious messages, depending on what we want to say about, what we're trying to communicate in terms of God's message that day. So it's, and the same as action. Action can also bind neurologically too. So repeated action can also do things that people don't realize. So even like crowd behavior and things like that can be very emotional and quite powerful if you're in a rally, for instance, and those kinds of things. So the more, there's a reason why emotional preachers who whip up emotion, can be quite effective, because it kind of taps into these kind of subconscious things in quite powerful ways. Yeah, John?
I remember reading a while ago that the role of the internet in terms of, you've got a bell curve of views from extreme left and right, and what it sort of said in a lot of, and we naturally try to find people with similar view and maybe form a hive. And what it sort of said over the internet, because we're connected to so many people, even though you might have this extreme view at the end of the bell curve, very radical, etc., you will be able to find people somewhere across the world that believe in that as well. Mm-hmm. And that has sort of helped radicalism, if you like, because even though you're, dispersed in society and maybe feel powerless, once you are able to congeal into a hive, if you like, you can then that reinforces, validates your view, and then you can go forward and maybe plan various things. So I was just wondering, whether that internet role, and you mentioned Facebook a number of times, whether that has, do you believe, helped radicalisation, some of the more extreme type of views out there?
I think it's accelerated processes that would have been slower in the past. I was talking actually with Pastor Matthias after church this morning at St. Peter's at Indooroopilly, and he was raised the social media thing. And in the past, the thing is, people say unthinking things on Facebook or social media. You often respond very rapidly without thinking anything through, whereas in the past, if you had to write a letter, and so even in emails, people will say unthinking things too, but it's not quite as instant as these kind of other instant social media things. And so we're less caring about what we say and much more into the instant response. We don't think about it, we just do it. And so I think it's tapping more and more into this just gut level kind of responding, rather than reasoned thinking response. So, I mean, one of the things about this research about dual processing in the brain with the moral intuitions is that it's not that we can't change our gut level response, it's just it's difficult. But we can actually overcome it if we really rationally resist what our gut level response is. So part of it is the more space you have to reason about something, probably, and the more time and distance, the less problematic it is. But yes, I think social media is kind of just accelerating or exaggerating processes that have always been there, but it's just now much more instant. Yeah. Anybody else? Well, if not, why don't we wrap up there, because it's getting late, and I'd like to finish, I think, with a group prayer, if everyone's happy with that, and get everyone to hold hands across the aisles with each other, since it's all about building empathy and community and being with each other.